So this is going to be part 3 of the linguistic aspect of writing. We're going to talk about two things, hopefully. We're going to talk about phonology and morphology. When we're talking about phonology, this is another one of those sound-oriented parts of linguistics, but it has to do with the logic behind how sounds are formed. So, what's the official thing? Studies the rules governing the structure, distribution, and sequencing of speech sounds and the shape of syllables. It deals with the sound system of a language by treating the phoneme as the point of departure. A phoneme is the smallest linguistic unit of sound that can signal a difference in meaning. When we talk about morphology, we're going to have a similar relationship. We'll have morphemes and morphology. So morphemes are the smallest pieces of language, written or sound-oriented, that can affect meaning. So it's the smallest unit. So morpheme and phoneme, the eem is essentially smallest, but that's how we know what those are. And then phonology and morphology are both the logic of. So one is the logic of the sound systems, and morphology is the logic behind how words are built and the word formation processes. So when we talk about phonology, this is different than phonetics. Phonetics is how we form words and recognize sounds with our ears, for the most part, and maybe some classification. Phonology helps us understand how those patterns fit together to build other languages or build communication. It can be by understanding how sound systems work. We start to see challenges people have when they're crossing over. So for instance, if someone has a Spanish-speaking background, in Spanish, we have K sounds, we have T sounds, we have S sounds and H sounds. But compared to English, some of the reasons that comedians get so much play out of the crossover between, I'm thinking Fluffy and the Iglesias guy, but the reason some comedians and that sort and other people get a lot of play out of those comparisons. Say, for instance, the English pronunciation of shoes as chus. Get your chus. I'm not making fun of people. Don't judge me. Don't get upset. I promise. But when we use to understand that language variation, that form of accenting that's happening to the language, it partially connects with how often certain, not just sounds show up in the Spanish language versus the English language, but the combination of those sounds. So SH, SK, ST, they have different, in English, those sorts of formations happen up to 40% more than in the Spanish language. So when someone's struggling with that, coming from Spanish to English, it's not because they don't get language, it's that they don't have practice. And so it's learning a new part of a language, and that's kind of how language learning works. So when people with that background carry over and try and learn the English language, they're not used to actually the combination of sounds, S and T, S and K, S and H, the same way. But they're also not used to having those sounds at the beginning of words, like skate or shoe or that sort of thing. So some of those words become harder for certain people groups with different language backgrounds. Your language background and your knowledge of sounds and your practice with sounds and the logic of how sounds are formed in one language or in one variety or in one dialect, that background carries over and changes the way what practice you have in the other language. And so that's why some of those things can be kind of challenging. It's based on the logic behind the sounds and how they're organized and kind of the patterns of those sounds and the combinations of syllables and that sort of thing. I'm going to leave that at that for now, but phonology is the logic or the system governing how the sounds are built. And different languages, different cultures, different contexts and different varieties and dialects have different ways that sounds get built, with different sounds that are privileged, different formations that are privileged. So it can be really interesting sometimes when you're trying to figure out some of that crossover, why it's happening. But it can also help us better understand where the next thing we're going to go to it can help us figure out when English is borrowing from Latin or Greek or French or some other language, or German, why it is that the pattern changes. And so we want to be aware of how sounds work, how certain sounds get privileged, and that there's a logic behind the sound system of a language that changes how things are, that ends up bleeding into morphology and how things are spelled and written. So let's go down to that. With morphology, similar things are happening. Morphology is, again, the logic behind the language. And we'll talk a little more about morphology when we discuss writing systems, because that's fun. Lots of fun. And so when we discuss morphology, we're concerned with the internal organization of words, morphemes, and how words are built. So some people think of the alphabet as the building blocks of language, and that's not really true. The alphabet is a representation of the language, and what we really have are combinations of letters to create meaning. So building blocks of languages with meaning are morphemes, and the logic behind how we make meaning or new meaning out of words is morphology. Examples. You may have heard of this in the past if people have encouraged you to think about Latin and Greek root words, to think about prefixes and suffixes, to think about word families and how things are, how words are built. Let's see if this board's going to work. So for instance, so let me do, what's a good word? I like using the example circumspect. It's a weird word that it's kind of one of those $10 words that not everybody gets. I'm in a new office, so my whiteboard does not work. And of course, it's backwards for you, so I'm going to have to work on that. But if we're talking about circumspect, if we were trying to figure out what this word meant, we would have to break it down into its pieces. So we would have circum, and we would have spect, or circ, and spect. This is kind of a grammatical ending that shifts the way it combines. But what we would want to do to use morphology as a lens of analysis is we want to say what other words connect or have that same word family. So I'm going to do my best to do this backwards. So if we're thinking about it, what do you think? Brainstorming. What words have spect in them? So you might say spectacle. Nope, did that backwards. That wasn't anywhere close. All right, I'm just going to do this without the board. It's backwards. But if we take that word, circumspect, we look for similar words. Inspect, introspective, retrospect, in retrospect. Spectacles, spectacle, spectacular. All of these things, what do you do with spectacles? You look through them. What do you do with a spectacle? You look at it. When something's spectacular, you see how amazing it is. When you inspect something, you look into it. When you're retrospective, you look back. When you're introspective, you look inward. All of these things have to do with looking. So we know that the word circumspect, even if we didn't have the definition or couldn't get to Siri, Lady Siri or Sir Google, we know that the word circumspect is built by these other families of words in the same way. And so all of those things that have that spect root, even if we can't look it up, we can use what we do know through that word family to say it's got something to do with looking. Now, what words have circ or circum in them? We've got circ. People usually say circ, circle, circumference, circumvent. Usually about this time I'll get circumcision. It takes a little while in an actual classroom for people to feel comfortable, and then everybody giggles. It's like saying underwear to third graders. Don't feel bad. It's normal. It's cool. Well, circumcision is not normal. It's kind of special. That's a whole other thing. Don't get distracted by that. All right, so when we're talking morphology, we're talking about how these words are built. So we've got circumspect. We know spect is looking. We know circ. Well, with a circle, what is it? It's round. The circumference is the distance around, or the measure around a circle. It's not area. Don't get me in trouble with your math professors. Circumvent is to go around, or to vent around, travel around. Circumference, Circumcision, that's always a fun one. We can look at that one all on its own as its own special example. When we look at circum, we know we're getting kind of patterns of around. So what's the scission there? We've got incision. We've got scissors. So that root is kind of a cutting. And so incision is to cut into. Scissors are implements for cutting. So a circumcision is a cut around, which is what it is. Hopefully it didn't gross you out. Anyway, so when we think about circumspect, all of those circle, circumference, circumcision all had this pattern of being around. And so when we're saying circumspect, it's essentially looking around. And so this comes, there's an old phrase that says walk circumspectly, walk looking around. It's a way of saying be careful. When I worked on, like if you're going down a dark alley, walk circumspectly, or don't go down a dark alley, but be careful, look around, pay attention. When I worked construction, we would talk about driving on a forklift. This principle, we wouldn't say circumspect, but we would say keep your head on a swivel, and so that way you don't squish anybody. So you look left, you look right, and you always keep your eyes in the direction of travel, and while also looking around to see if customers or people might step out from behind things. Because again, the goal is to not squish people. So you're careful, you're looking around, circumspect. It's fun, but that's just one word, one $10 kind of academic word that we can pull apart into its pieces, its individual morphemes that affect its meaning, and use the things we do know, the vocabulary we do know, to build that new word, the meaning of that unfamiliar word. This is an important analytical process when it comes to learning new language, and specifically when learning new academic language, because there are a lot of the same roots and word families and prefixes and suffixes mashed together in fields of psychology, sociology, chemistry, and all that fun stuff. That it will be new vocabulary, but if we have this lens, this analytical lens of morphology or phonology to pull those things apart, we become more effective in the long run as readers, as communicators, as writers, and as we try and acquire new language. Morphology is also cool. Another way of thinking about it, when we're looking at how individual symbols can change meaning, we might look at words like Latina, Latino, Chicana, Chicano, that kind of thing. Just that A in each of those. It's not always an individual letter, but shifting from from O to A or A to O, it has a meaning shift. And so, if you don't know much about Spanish, some of you probably do. It's obvious. For you if that's the case, but when you shift from Latino, which is, it could be men or just men, it could be men and women all encompassing, but Latina is usually just women, or niño, niña, niñita, that kind of thing. So that would be an individual letter changing the meaning of that word. So then that letter becomes the smallest morpheme or smallest unit of language that affects meaning when pulled apart. And so that's kind of fun. When we talk about verb conjugations, we're really dealing with morphology. How do we adjust the verb so that it tells us more information about sometimes gender, but more often singular versus plural, first, second person, whether it's an object or a person, so the different grammatical structures for different languages. But that's where morphology is really helpful. It helps us see the patterns behind the language and how they're built. Morphology, it's cool. Again, and so we can use that same method for breaking down the logic behind sounds or the logic behind meaning and the building blocks of words. And so words are not built on letters, words are built on letter units. And so these are called morphemes. And sometimes it's individual letters, but units of meaning. That's really the building block of words. So morphemes, smallest unit of meaning. Morphemes serve different purposes, so this will just to close. Some derive new words by changing the meaning or the part of speech. Others, so that's just others only refine and give extra grammatical information about the already existing meaning of a word. As morphemes are pairings of sounds with meanings, there are many complexities involved in forming a new field by the name of phonology. More phonology, that's always fun. So suffice to say, morphemes can affect meaning and communicate a shift in meaning, or the same meaning, but indicate a different grammatical structure. For instance, adding ed to the end of a word It doesn't change the meaning of the word. It changes kind of the temporal location of the action that it happened in the past, that kind of stuff. Or adding an S versus no S to some verbs. If I said he serves versus he serve, neither of those are wrong unless the convention says they are, unless enough people in your audience believe they are. But he serves is closer to a standard norm. He serve, we still get the idea. The meaning hasn't changed, but adding the S indicates a specific grammar, a second person or a third person grammatical structure and that sort of thing. So that's cool. With that, morphology, phonology, they're fun, and they're how we build words.